Hello and welcome to the podcast According to Sci-Faith, where we discuss topics revolving around the compatibility of science and faith. I'm Joshua Göcking and you're listening to According to Sci-Faith. Episode 43, What a Coincidence. So when we are talking about coincidence or random chance, it begs the question what we mean by that. What is this? Is there something like coincidences, things that occur just probabilistically? It seems to be so. Let's see what science has to tell us about that. So in most scientific disciplines, except for quantum mechanics, it is coincidences or random chance comes in because the system is too complex to describe it accurately or to describe it in an easy way. For example, if you just look at statistical physics, there you have the case that they are just the statistical physics is basically for example, the room in which you are sitting is basically there are many bajillion particles flying around, and just to describe what each of them is doing is just way too complex, way too difficult. But you don't need to, because you can approximate the behavior that is happening there. You can go into statistics, see what statistically it's happening, basically under the consideration that there is random chance, that you not that there is random chance, but basically that you consider the behavior of the particles to be random, that they are randomly flying around and so on. And with this, you can get quantities like temperature and so on to describe this system. This is basically how random chances or statistics or stochastics is used in science or in scientific disciplines. And there it is basically the problem is not that there is really random processes occurring, that really the particles are randomly flying around. It's just that it appears this way. It's just that the system is so complex that for us to describe it in a way where we have this all in a deterministic way, where we understand that there are no random chance, that there are no probabilities, nothing like this, but they all react to the interactions that they have with each other, it would be way too difficult, and it also would not be necessary, because it completely suffices to know what is the temperature in the room, what is all these quantities, the pressure and so on, these quantities that we can extract from this statistical and kind of statistical describing the system, instead of describing it accurately, perfectly deterministically, because we actually, what we need to know of some room, for example, in which we are sitting is usually, okay, what's the temperature, what's the pressure, and so on. We don't actually need to know what each individual particle is doing there, in which direction it is going, which speed it has, and so on. So therefore, it is not just that the system is complex and we just cannot solve it, but it's also that we don't need to solve it because we don't need to know the system in that much detail. So another example that you maybe know from your everyday life, and which is the basic thing that is attributed to random chance, is basically the throwing of a dice. So rolling a dice is usually considered to be a probabilistic event, but if you look into the really science and the mechanics of it, it's actually not random at all. So if I'm rolling a dice and I know the frequency with which I shake my hand, I know the height from which the dice will fall, I know its initial conditions, I know its weight, and all these data that I would need to have, then I really, in principle, I can then compute at which number it will fall upon. So I can really compute which it would be. However, of course, as I know, this is also much too complicated. It is, I think, easier than to describe all the particles in one room, but it's still very complicated. It's very hard to even get these data, to get a frequency by which I shake my hand. This is not really that easy. So it's hard to do. It's hard to predict. But in principle, it would be possible. In principle, it is not a random event in a sense that it's completely random, that there is no deterministic attribute to it, but it is random in a sense that it is too complex to predict, and especially for our brains, for us in our head to compute it, is much too complicated, especially in a short time that it would need to, for me to know, okay, how do I have to throw my dice such that I get the number that I want. And because of this, it's of course possible to use it for games where you really want to have this randomness included, because it's you are, as a user, usually you are not able to cheat this system. And in quantum mechanics, this is however different, because in quantum mechanics it is the fact that even if you look into individual particles, the behavior of individual particles, their behavior is described by probabilities, by real probabilities, by random chance. So you cannot anymore say how a particle will behave, but you can only give a probability whether it will behave in a certain way. Or to say it more clearly, if you do a measurement, then you know where the particle is, you can, or what you have measured about a particle, then you know this quantity. But what happens between the measurements you can only set a probability of what you would measure the particle to, what state you would measure the particle to be in if you would measure it at this certain point in time. So here it seems that this probabilistic nature is really inherent to the particle, that it is not that the system is too complex for us to describe, but that this is really an inherent part of these particles, an inherent part of nature, and therefore this differs from these other disciplines where random chance is basically included as kind of in kind of an and try to make these equations or make these predictions easier. Okay, time for a short break. And as usual in these breaks, I like to read a short excerpt of my new book or my new novel, Alien Thoughts. Patricia entered her office and sat down at her desk. Exhausted, she closed her eyes and collected herself. When she opened her eyes again, her eyes fell on a photo on her desk. It showed Tom and her just before they had broken up. She wondered why it was still there. Maybe it was because she hardly ever came into this office anymore. She spent most of her time in her office at the headquarters. When she looked closer, she realized how long it had been since she had seen Tom. His face was almost foreign to her. Suddenly, memories came flooding back. She had to think of the moment when they had met for the first time. It had been in this building, one floor below, in the lecture hall where she was giving her lecture this morning. She had been in the audience then. At first she had not liked Tom. He was cheeky and asked questions in every lecture, whether he was called or not. He was not afraid to use a cheeky tone, even in front of lecturers like Boris. She believed that was why Boris had been so disapproving of her relationship with Tom. While she was calmly processing the information and asking the lecturer questions in private after the lecture, Tom was behaving the opposite way. She thought it was rude and did not have a good opinion of Tom. He, on the other hand, was very interested in her. Something about her seemed to fascinate him, although she revealed little of herself in her shy manner. Her opinion of him changed abruptly when she realized that Tom and she were very much alike, even if it didn't look that way from the outside. He was just as enthusiastic about the accomplishment of the new government and believed in their justness as she did. His cheeky manner was just another expression of the same hunger for a just world that she also felt. Over time, they got to know each other better. Tom had had experiences similar to hers. The more they realized how similar they were, the more their affection for each other grew. Their initial dislike quickly turned into a deep love. Their similar past and shared ideals connected them. An almost inseparable relationship developed. But eventually it too came to an end, Patrizia realized bitterly. So this was a short excerpt in which I tell about this relationship between Patrizia and Tom, so the background of it, and Tom will occur later in the novel. So if you want to find more about how this works out, what's happening between them, then I encourage you to buy the book, to read it, so you can get it on Amazon. And if you liked it, then I really encourage you to write a review. This just helps other readers to get to know the book and to know if this book is something for them too. However, it's still not completely understood what random chance actually is. What is this? How is it determined? Or random chance is basically defined to not be determined, to be that there is a randomness, that there is something that you cannot determine beforehand in it included. But how is this to understand? How does this work? And so on, that there is no real way to grasp that, to understand that, and therefore it is still also not understand yet. But this concept of random chance has been around for some time. I mean, since people could thought or could talk about things, they were talking about random chance, because everyone experienced events that appeared randomly to them, that they appeared to be either lucky or unlucky to them. And even already the Romans were talking about this. For example, they had this saying where they had also a deity which they used to describe this. So there was this deity Fortuna, which was basically the god of luck, or fortune, of destiny and so on. And whether it depended on whether this deity was in favor of you or not. On this it depended whether you had a lucky life or lucky circumstances or not. And in this context, the Romans had this saying of fortune favors the brave, was what basically means that the brave people basically that fortune, so this deity of fortune would favor them. So for example, Julius Caesar was also convinced of that, and was putting this to the many battles he fought, and it seemed to actually have been true, because he in most of his battles he was outnumbered, and therefore it seemed that his courage, his bravery to still fight with his men was something that fortune favored, and hence they won. Of course, here you can argue that this was not really the case, that basically because Julius Caesar was also a great tactician and a strategist of war, he maybe because of that he succeeded, although he was in many cases outnumbered. But this was what he was saying, and this was what the Romans were believing. Today you oftentimes hear kind of different statements. Today you rather hear that fortune is in some sense also worked for, that you work for it, or and there the logic behind it is that because you try again, especially in sports, if you say, okay, I train, I learn, I try again, and if then in the game I get a lucky shot, then it's not because I'm so lucky, but it is because I was really beforehand training, and just as a rule of statistics, it then happens that I get lucky when I'm doing my shot and so on. But also that I sometimes get not lucky, but sometimes get lucky. But by increasing basically the times I do this and so on, I also increase the chance of things working out and so on. So this is basically the reasoning behind this. But as you can see, in every culture there was this awareness of this fortune or random chance or of this thing happen, and we found different ways to deal with this, to think of this. And I think the question is random chance real, or is there some interpretation of it? In faith, can we find an interpretation of this? So I think if we relate it to faith, there we will also oftentimes see it in cases where, for example, a person just barely escaped death and so on. Then there we can ask, okay, was this fortunate? Was this providence? What was behind that? And this is oftentimes what we ask ourselves then. Was this, for example, if one barely escaped death or almost died because of some almost accident or something, then you might ask, okay, was this God protecting me? Was I just lucky? What happened there? And I think in some sense we can see it this way, but we also have to consider that, for example, there are also many random events or seemingly random events that turn out pretty negatively. And then you would also say, okay, if God protected this person in that situation, did he punish this person in this situation, or what is going on here? And I think there needs to be a broader explanation of this. So one thing that I heard state, oftentimes it's attributed to Albert Einstein, but I do not believe that he said it. But the statement itself is still interesting, and this is coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. So basically, it states that God uses coincidence or seeming coincidence to remain anonymous, so that we don't see his working in this world because it looks random to us. So is this actually true? And I think, as I said, yeah, it might be true, or to some degree, but what is then with negative random chances? Is he also behind this? And I do not think that this is the case, but I think, as we know from the Bible, as we know from Scripture, there's not only God, but he has also an adversary, the devil, who is working against him. And therefore, you could also say that these negative random chances are kind of the ways of this adversary to remain anonymous. And it depends on who has more power over a person, basically, which happens more. But I think this still not describes it completely. And I think we need to also consider that random chance and coincidence in quantum mechanics, as I have stated several times on this podcast, this is what gives us the way to be this gives us a way for free will. So this gives science a realm in which free will can basically exist, or an understanding that free will could be possible, because the world is not deterministic, and therefore there might be something like free will. So this fact of random chance in nature seems to give way to something like free will to exist. And then you need to ask yourself, okay, what is actually free will? How could you, for example, distinguish something like free will from random chance? And the answer is you couldn't, because you cannot understand free will. You cannot say, okay, free will is basically not being determined by some outset. It's being free in your choice. And the same is true for random chance. Random chance means not being set by the outset, but something random can happen anytime. So you actually could not distinguish free will from random chance, and therefore you could basically say that random chance might be or could be yielded back to something like free will of people, that free decisions of people would seem arbitrary, would seem like random chance, and maybe there is a connection between that. And I think what we need to understand is that there is this really occurring fact of random chance that might be influenced by free will, by our decisions, and that might also be influenced by providence of God, and also by negative plans of the adversary of God, and so on. But I think the important part is to not put this into a perspective that only good things happening to the good and only bad things to the bad, and so on, because here the scripture is also pretty clear. And because it says in Matthew 5 verse 45, it says that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends his rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So these seemingly random things or fortunate things like rain, it says here, are put to the righteous and the unrighteous. So there is some certain randomness or some certain providence for those, the good and the bad, that God provides. And therefore it is not a case that you can say, okay, it's just good things happening to the good and bad things happening to the bad. But I think it's kind of that everyone is getting it in the same way, but there is a divine providence, and there is God helping us out of if something negative happens to us. But also we need to understand that God is not the one who brings these negative things. So the random chance is there also kind of included, and this is also kind of the fact that we live in a fallen world in which this can manifest itself, and it seems random to us because we cannot describe it scientifically, we cannot understand it in this deterministic way, but it is actually not random in this sense, but it is just kind of this undescribable feature, or scientifically undescribable feature, which depends on different quantities, I would say, which depends in some sense on our free will, and in at large on the collective free will of everyone. So the consequences of this collective free will, if you would say, or this collective consequences of the free will of each individual, and so on. And I think on many things, and I think you cannot really get a complete picture what leads to this random chance, but I think you have to understand that the fact that random chance seems to be in this universe, that it seems to not be something where we cannot describe it as in quantum mechanics, where it is really intrinsic in nature. This shows that there is something like free will, and this free will is to some degree responsible for these random events, or can be attributed to it. And whether this is can be completely attributed to it, or whether there is really some completely random things, this I'm not sure yet. I think we will never completely understand it, but I think random chance and coincidence, this is a mystery that we cannot solve scientifically, and I think answers like coincidence is God's way of staying anonymous, and the fact that free will is indistinguishable from random chance, and therefore we could basically say that in some sense random chance shows that there is free will, or is maybe even in some sense equivalent to that. So I think these are interesting ideas, and I think interesting ways to look at it and see that random chance is not so random after all. So that's everything for today's episode. I hope you liked it and you enjoyed each part of it. If you want to get in touch with me or discuss a topic or want to give me some feedback, then feel free to contact me using the contact form on my website, sci-faith.de/en. And there you can go to the contact tab and contact me. And if you have any other things or episodes you want to have covered there, or topics you want to have covered, feel free to contact me there. Also, if you are not yet familiar with the format in which this podcast is produced, let me just briefly explain it to you. So there always at the beginning of a month or of a block, there is a big block of 4 episodes in one thing. It's kind of like a preview, which I call it, where you have the next 4 episodes all in one episode together, combined. And this is for people who like to hear long format podcasts, who have a long way to work or something else, where they can listen to a long episode and can then have a preview of the next 4 episodes all at once, and are completely up to date from the beginning of the block. For those who like their episodes shorter, who prefer it if they have a half an hour or even less of a podcast episode, for those there is every week afterwards will appear a podcast episode almost in that length, and this way I can publish every week a new podcast every episode, and everyone can have it his own way, either once a month a long chunk of content, or once a week a shorter format podcast episode. So I think that's the best way for everyone, and also for me when I'm producing it. Please also note that this is an independent podcast, which means that it is recorded, produced, and marketed by me. So I really need your support in this. So if you like this podcast, then give it a 5-star rating. And if you have the time, even write a review to it. This just helps other listeners to become aware of this podcast. And then people who might be interested in this content can become aware of it. Also, if you have friends who you think would like this content, then recommend it to them and share it with them. Also, you can support me in other ways, for example by reading my blog and subscribing to my newsletter, or even by reading my books, which you can find on Amazon. For example, there is my latest novel out now is Alien Thoughts, which is pretty entertaining from the feedback that I gotten, and so it's also in some way related to science and faith. The topic of it is also in there, but of course you can also read the book to this podcast, Sci-Faith, The Compatibility of Science and Faith, which is also available in English since last year. Thank you for that, and now I wish you a wonderful day, and I'm looking forward for you to tune in again next time.